All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are very excited to have you here. It's Richard Harris from Sales Hacker, and that's our ode to the big race that happened a few weekends ago down at Churchill Downs. So we hope you all had a good time watching that. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit more important. It's about creating your onboarding playbook, and this is something that I get asked about all the time. I've got table of contents for onboarding playbooks because sometimes people are looking at that kind of stuff. And we've decided to bring in an expert rather than a consultant like me, somebody who's actually done this and been doing this over and over at scale, which is super, super critical. Before I do an quick introduction, I do want to say, obviously we're going to record this today for everybody in case you missed something. You can come back and watch it. If you want to forward this on to other peers or friends, please do so in the reshare. If you've been to our Sales Hacker webinars, by all means, ask questions as we go throughout. This is not a lecture series where Robbie and I want to sit here and pontificate high-level thoughts and pretend like we're the master experts at everything. We think we're pretty smart, but we know there's a lot of smart people around us who support us, either in our organizations or within the community, so we really want to share that tribal knowledge where we can. So with that being said, I really want to take a minute and introduce Robbie. He's done some amazing stuff, and he's been with companies that I think we all know for some time. He carried as sales AE for many years in the HR SaaS space. So he's got a working knowledge of what it takes in the HR space. And then he built the outbound program at Zenefits, right? Where he opened an office and hired, ramped, and managed 250 sales reps as Zenefits went from 5 million to 70 million in ARR. Like, that is no small task. That is a huge accomplishment. So Robbie, I'm glad you have that experience, and I'm glad you're willing to bring it to us. After that, Robbie went on to do global sales development at a company called Flexport, where he was responsible for scaling a team across 8 global offices. That's 8, right? Not all in the United States, they're everywhere. And going from 5 to 30, building and implementing a playbook for outbound and driving down ramp times. Again, this is probably one of the most critical things we need to talk about. And this is a little bit longer of an introduction than we normally give, but I really feel like Robbie's credentials really need to be mentioned here. He's now head of sales at Mixmax, where he's building communication platforms for the modern sales pro. They went from 0 to 4 million in 18 months, self-serve. So that's an amazing accomplishment. They recently raised Series A via SaaStr, 10 million in January. They've got 10,000 customers, and without getting into a whole bunch of detail, their tools integrate sales, customer success, and HR recruiting, and they integrate that into Gmail. So we'll spend a little bit of time later talking about what they do. But Robbie, thank you so much for making some time for us today. Sorry for the long intro, but I really felt like you've accomplished a lot, and I know people are just going to love to eat up everything you have to say. So thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, Richard. I appreciate the introduction. It feels a little bit weird that we're just sitting across the bay from each other and not in the same room having this conversation, but either way, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. So folks, if you have questions along the way, please go into the question feature or the chat box and place them in. I'll be monitoring those throughout the session. This is a little bit of a PowerPoint, but no death by PowerPoint, we promise, and a little bit of a fireside chat. So we're going to combine all this together. Also, we encourage socialization. So please feel free to go in and post your name, your company, how big your team is, all that kind of stuff. Just let people know who you are so we can talk to you and understand your world. So without any further ado, enough of Richard. Robbie, why don't you go ahead and sort of get us started, and why are we even talking about this onboarding thing? Haven't people sort of figured this shit out yet? Sorry, pardon my language.
You'd think so, Richard. I think that, in sales, we're so focused on the number, and when you think about the team that you've got that you're going to battle with every day, those are the folks that are already ramped up, right? The folks that are carrying a bag and that are responsible for driving revenue for your company. And I think that oftentimes the first thing that you let go of as a sales leader is the new folks, right? And kind of getting them ramped up. And it's easy to sort of think, it'll sort itself out, and the people that were meant to be successful will be. But I think, I've spent a lot of time onboarding folks in my career and building out onboarding programs and measuring it. And it's something that I think there are just a couple things that every organization can do to make it go a little bit faster and get ramps to be a little bit more productive. And so I'm hoping today to just call upon a little bit of experience that I've had, share a couple of best practices, answer some questions, and just sort of be a part of the sales hacker community.
Yeah, and you know, Robbie, this is one of those questions I didn't even rehearse with you, so let's see how you do. When you first started, right? Like when you first started managing, right? Not now, because now you've sort of got your own playbooks. How long do you think it sort of got you to ramp somebody? Like, what was your sort of, okay, I'm walking in at Zenefits, we're at this level. It normally took me at Zenefits 3 months, 6 months. I was able to whittle it down to X. You have anything you can share? And it could be at Flexport too. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, when you're ramping as a new manager, to ramp a rep alongside of you is more of a challenge than I think a lot of people realize. I think it's all about scale to a certain extent. When you think about if you can sit hip to hip with, you know, 3, 4, maybe 5 reps, then you can personally show them all of the tips and tricks in your playbook. But really beyond that number 4 or 5, managers start to like lose kind of effectiveness and get spread a little bit too thin across multiple direct reports. And I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call that are thinking to themselves, I've got 15 direct reports. Well, that's the purpose of this conversation, is to talk about some things that aren't going to require hours and hours of your attention to decrease ramp time. But I think it's a challenge for everybody. And I think we need to be asking ourselves, what are some ways that we can build in automation and be a little bit smarter about this, rather than just seeing time as the only way, time spent as the only way to decrease ramp time?
Sounds great. Go ahead. Let's get started.
All right, cool. So I'm going to jump into this, and I think the way that I like to think about levers for growth, and I promise we won't be in a PowerPoint for this whole presentation, but basically in sales, you have 2 primary levers for growth. You can hire more reps as a manager, and then you can make those reps more effective. And so for today's webinar, we're going to talk about number 2. And the way that I think about making reps more effective, just in really simple terms, is 3 things. Speed to productivity. And so that's basically the amount of time it takes a rep to be ramping to become productive. And so that's going to be the primary thing we talk about today. And then sort of the other 2 things that cascade beyond that are efficiency and cycles. And so that's, you know, you can think of that as deal velocity, and then effectiveness. And you can think of that in terms of, you know, the ability to capture larger contract values and increase the number of wins that we're having so that overall win rates go up. And I think the reason that the first point, the speed to productivity, is so important is just because, you know, it has a cascading effect where deals start to become faster and reps are more efficient, and they're more effective if you nail the first 2 months on the job. So that's kind of why we're spending a little bit of time zooming in on this, breaking it down, and talking about a couple ways that you can make reps more productive by decreasing ramp time.
So, Robbie, a couple of questions. So, first of all, let's say you were consulting a company, you know, and again, it always depends, but would you say that ramp time, a goal to improve your ramp time should always be, let's get them effective within 2 months? Is it to reduce the percentage from here to here so that you don't care if their ramp time used to be 6 months, if they can get it to 4, that's a good win? Or is your ultimate goal to always get it in 60 days? Like, just you've been in a lot of different places. Do you think you think there's a cookie cutter model to get everybody effective and efficient and ramped in 60 days?
I think that there's a framework. I think 2 months is my benchmark for myself, whether that's because I've been able to do that at past organizations and I'm hell-bent on doing it at Mixmax now. Maybe that's the case. We're going to look at some data points later in the presentation that will help the viewers on this call think about, based on how big and complex my deal cycles are, how long ramp time should theoretically take. And I think people are going to be surprised by this data. In that there are organizations at every level of deal size that are doing it in a very short period of time and a very long period of time. So it's a decision to make. And I think 2 months is a good benchmark, and we'll do a little bit of we'll do a math equation to look at what the difference in 2 months and 6 months is on the next couple slides. But I just think it's a huge lever that it's really easy to punt it. And really, when you think about how much contribution your reps are making to the business, it really is time in productivity, and productivity should be defined as ramped performance. So if we assume productivity is month over month hitting your quoted target, then we should be thinking about reducing the amount of time it takes for a new hire to get to productivity.
All right, so let's stop there for a second and define a couple of things. So one, we need to define what ramped means at your own company, right?
Sure.
And so from your perspective, it's getting them to hitting their goal, achieving 75% of their goal, or is it really sort of a company-based thing to say, hey, here's where we are now, this is our baseline, and for the next cohort of hires or the next two cohort of hires, we just want to reduce it by X, knowing that in a year from now we're going to get to Y. Is that kind of how you're suggesting people start to approach this if they're going to start to make changes?
I think there's a little bit of danger in saying in a year we want to be here. I think a lot of the stuff we're talking about you can do today and make an improvement today. And you know, I think the way to think about this is from the moment an offer letter is accepted and you're projecting, you know, a new hire to start, it's the amount of time between that moment, not their start date, but the moment that they accept to join onto your team or your company, to the moment that they are hitting 100% of their quoted target. Now, I know a lot of companies have different philosophies on how quotas should work, whether that's having a 75% quota actually be 100%. We're not going to go down that path. I think that's another webinar entirely. But for the purpose of conversation, we should be thinking about this as the amount of time between an offer letter being signed to that rep reaching productivity, which is hitting 100% of their quota month over month as the ramp time that we want to decrease.
That's great. And again, I'm just trying to create clear definitions for people to think about, right? Okay. So we want to define productivity as hitting goal, not, and I know some companies will say productivity as, hey, let's just get them to break even, right? Because then that sort of looks good, right? And again, that's not the ultimate goal of sales. Like, you know, that's just not where we want to be. We're not in the business to break even, right? We're in the business of profitability. So I'm really glad we sort of clarified those things. And I don't know if we should talk about it here or later, but I'm going to bring it up real quick. You talked about deal velocity and you talked about efficiency in the cycle, right? When you talk about efficiency in the cycle, are you talking about the different tools that they're using in the sales stack? Or are you also including in that efficiency the effectiveness of the rep, right? Like I'm a big effectiveness guy. You guys, you and I've had some fun on Twitter and social media this week. I'm a big about teaching the reps to improve their conversation, which makes them more effective, which in my mind makes them more efficient, but you're sort of calling it differently. So let's just take a second and talk about this efficiency and effectiveness just for a bit as you see it as it relates to this ramping.
Sure, and you're right. You've taken a firm position on the effectiveness side of things. I think you could argue that a lot of the sort of modern sales pros, modern leaders are really focused on efficiency and sort of using tooling to improve velocity and therefore improve win rates. It's all important, right? It's all part of sort of like a cohesive strategy to win as a team. And, I think the way I see efficiency is basically the ability to move through cycles with as little friction as possible. When you're early on, there's so many I shouldn't even say early on. No matter what, there's always going to be roadblocks. And I think the way that sales leadership should think about it is how can we remove roadblocks so reps can move more efficiently? And then what kind of exposure and training can we give to increase effectiveness? And effectiveness goes even beyond that. But I think that the part that a lot of companies are not necessarily thinking about is how does ramp time impact efficiency and effectiveness, not only in the short term, but the long term as well.
Great. So I'm going to give you a big bingo on my sound app, right? So that's the goal.
Bingo!
Right? We're going to try and have a little fun today, right? All right, let's go. I'll back off. Go forward with the next one.
All right, cool. So, I think the first thing to call out is like, I've made a lot of mistakes managing, ramping, just in life in general. And some of the things that I've come back to time and time again that I think probably a lot of people can relate to, just as it relates to onboarding, are as follows. And so the first one is accepting a long ramp as just an inevitable fact. When you join an organization, let's say you sell a complex product, or the product or service you're offering for one reason or another is a longer deal cycle. And that's just what the historic data tells us. Because of that, there's sort of this common belief and acceptance that ramp time should be sort of extended over a multitude of months or quarters, just because it takes that long to get reps up to speed. I'm going to call BS on that. I think that I've had the fortune to work at some companies that have made some products that have been like fairly intuitive, and folks have ramped a little bit quicker. But I've talked to enough people about this that I think that there's some things that you can do to move the needle right away. Absolutely, there's going to be different ramp times based on your customer and your product and your market. But what we shouldn't do is come in and just accept it as inevitable, and rather look at it as an opportunity to improve.
Excellent.
So that's one thing. The second thing is overemphasizing learning by shadowing. So when you hire an AE, I think one of the easiest things to do is just think to yourself, how quickly can I get this rep on the phone, demoing, selling, doing the things that I ultimately hired them to do. And an easy thing to do there, and even sort of a common sense thing to do there, is to have that new AE spend the majority of their ramping time shadowing a ramped AE. And I think what I've found just in studying this for a while is that it often leads to thinking about the result and not necessarily like the foundational elements of what makes something successful. Because if you enter a demo call, you never saw what happened on the discovery and sort of the process leading up to it. So I think that it's just, you got to be a little bit careful about learning by shadowing. And I'll talk about how we do our ramp plan here at Mixmax. And you'll see that actually doesn't really happen until like week 5 of hiring somebody. And then the last part is just failing to micromanage the first 2 weeks. Nobody wants to be a micromanager. Nobody wants to label themselves as that. It's a little bit of a faux pas, but micromanaging the first 2 weeks is so critical to making sure that you're hitting all of the points and foundational elements of a rep building the skill set they need to ramp successfully, that the failure to do that basically makes reducing your ramp time impossible. So what I want people to think about as we go through this is my ramp time inevitable? I'll give you the answer. It's not. And there's things that we can do to improve it. How quickly am I putting my new hires into rooms shadowing demos versus sort of coaching them on some of the other core skill sets they're going to need? And how much expectation setting and micromanaging am I doing in the first 2 weeks of my onboarding program? So just some like thought-provoking things, and I've gotten these wrong over and over again, and only now am I kind of realizing that these are some things that don't necessarily work.
Yeah, and I want to speak to a couple of things too. Is and I hope you'll speak to them later. Is I do think there's different types of shadowing, right? So I don't know. I hope you're going to cover that later. If not, let's come back to it. But this piece about micromanaging, like this is so critical. I'm a Gen Xer, and if you've listened to me before, I've said this all the time. What I thought was micromanaging back in the day of telling me what to do every day for 2 weeks, I've seen in this generation, particularly of people starting their sales career, they see that as coaching. And I'd say one of the biggest challenges I've seen, particularly, again, there's a lot of Gen Xers who are in management or executive management, and we get frustrated with well, why can't they figure it out? Just figure it out. I used to figure it out. That's how I did it, right? And we're sort of becoming, these crotchety old people who just expect someone to figure it out. And that's not the way the generations behind us are coming along, and nor should they be. Like, we as Gen Xers have to recognize, like, there's so much more knowledge available to people than there was to us. It was not easy. Like, we used to go to this place called the library to do things. It was not on your computer in your lap in college, right? It just didn't exist that way. So micromanaging to me, I think is actually a really positive sign, because I think the generations behind my generation don't mind being micromanaged to be taught. What they don't want to be micromanaged is, how's that deal today? Did anything happen today? What happened this morning? Did you get in touch with Bob? Did Sarah call you back? Like, that's micromanaging. Coaching is not micromanaging, in my opinion. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'll turn this back over to you, Rob.
I think that's a great point. And I think too, like, it's funny, you use this library analogy, right? You think about a library, and when you go there and you access information in a library, everything is printed. And because it's printed, everything is, nothing is really changing or evolving in real time, right? A library is sort of a stagnant repository of information that you can go to access time and time again. You know what you're getting, there's not a lot of surprises. That is not the case with the modern working environment for a sales organization. Not only are the dashboards and sort of real-time updates that are hitting your plate updating on sort of a microsecond basis, but the tooling, the strategy, the approach, and sort of like how are we going to sell this thing is evolving in every organization in real time. And you can't just look at the onboarding program as sort of like one packaged document that you put a couple hours into and then it's good. You have to manage your onboarding program the same way you manage your sales process, which is you pick up information in the market, you hear things from your customers, and you adapt and adjust. That needs to trickle its way back down to the way that you micromanage your team in the first 2 weeks.
Yep. Yeah, and don't get me started on microfiche. Like, and if people don't know what that is, please go Google it. You'll be surprised. That's how I had to find something in the library. But let's go ahead. Thanks, Rob.
That's awesome. So a little bit of context. Those are some mistakes that I've made. And now what I want to do is actually just kind of give an example. And I did a little bit of research using some awesome documentation from the Bridge Group. If you guys haven't heard of them, check them out. They do some really good reports every year on just the state of inside sales. And give some really great industry benchmarks. So taking a look at that, it's going to give us a little bit of a framework to think about, well, what are the average ramp times in today's modern inside sales workforce? Now, if you look at the bar or the chart on the right-hand side, what you can see is 3 to 5 months makes up about 40% of the average ramp time. This was a poll that they did with hundreds and hundreds of participants that fit effectively the category on average of modern inside sales organizations of various different shapes and sizes. And you can see there's a spectrum that ranges from 1 month, although that's a very small data point, all the way to more than 7 months. And so that is basically to say that there is not one perfect recipe here. But I just did a little bit of quick math on what is the actual cost to the business of a 6-month ramp. So if we look at that 5 to 7 months, 25% of the overall participants fell into that bucket. So if we look at a 6-month ramp, let's say that we have an AE who has $120,000 OTE, that's split 50-50. Their quota is 4x what their OTE is, so it's a $400,000 annual quota. And it takes them 6 months to ramp. Well, if we look at that, their revenue contribution in the first 6 months is going to be about $33,000. And then you can see for the remaining 6 months of that first year, now that they're ramped and at productivity, you're going to get about $200K back for a fully ramped AE. So the total revenue contribution from that AE is about $233,000 for the year. And the gross margin that the business is making basically on that once the AE is paid out, and that's not factoring in the rest of the elements of customer acquisition costs like marketing and success and everything else. So that's something to call out. But just as it relates to the math on the AE, that gives you a gross margin of $113,000. Now, Richard, you mentioned earlier, like there are some sales organizations that are thinking about how do we just break even on a sales hire? So it's worth talking about. Not everybody is always going to have, everybody has different margins, everybody has different business models. But for the purpose of this, let's just look at this AE that ramps in 6 months' time. And then let's actually take a look at what the improvement would be on the bottom line if we did it in 2 months. Now, there's a lot of steps we got to take to get there. But if I flip to the next slide, there's going to be a bunch of numbers, so I don't want to freak everybody out. But I'm going to point you out 2 things on what the difference in the gross margin of the business is for a rep that ramps in 6 months versus 2 months. Cool? So jumping over here, what we just went through on the left side, 113K. Now, if we do that in 2 months, that rep is going to bring in that same 33K in 2 months' time. That's going to be a 330K contribution to the business, a total revenue contribution of 363, and a 215% increase on the gross margin. So that gross margin just went from 113 to 243K. So all this is to say is that there is a lot of juice to be squeezed out of shortening your reps ramp time. And there's probably a lot of people who are thinking themselves, yeah, that's pretty obvious, but I think it's good to put it in numbers just to contextualize what is my opportunity. And you can go through this exercise really easily to just think about what would the win for my team be if I were able to reduce ramp time by 30 days. Does that make sense, Richard?
It makes complete sense. And so, again, I'm going to give us another bingo, right? That's one of those aha moments that we need to discuss. And I think there's something to be said too, like, as sales leaders, this is really great. And I think, people need to really, pull out your phone, take a picture of this slide. This is something you want to think about, sleep on, work with, you might even want to work with your COO or CFO to sort of say, hey, I'm trying to improve this, and create your right hypothesis. Granted, a quota of 400K could be different. Your margins may be very different. If you're working for Yelp, your margins are way different. Your value is way different. So you're going to need to take some time and figure this out for yourself. So the one thing I really want to make sure people understand is this is rock solid data. I love that it's available. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, but please, everybody, don't just take this picture and go, we're going to go from 6 months to 2 months and we're going to increase our margin by 215%. You got to figure out what works in your organization, ask questions, get help, contact other sales leaders that you're working with to see if they're working on this kind of stuff, because this is something, when you get it right and you can speak to it internally, this is the kind of stuff that can really help you not just improve your own team's performance, but it shows you as a thought leader, and it can actually build your career, right? So I think it's a really important thing. And Robbie, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to sort of call this out. Are there any sort of, hey, watch out for this stuff, everybody, as you look at these kinds of things? I called out a couple of little things, but is there something else you want to sort of give to the advice to the group around this crunching this kind of data?
Yeah, some gotchas. I think one of the big things is just understanding what your customer acquisition cost is, because you can take that gross margin of 243K, but maybe you were pouring a ton of money into marketing, or you had a lot of other lead gen efforts that were not factored into the cost of that AE's OTE. So just be honest with yourself about where else that gross margin is kind of going to get pulled away from. But I think overall, like, this is a number that I think modern sales pros kind of need to understand, is just what is my rep's contribution to the business in terms of gross margin, and then understanding what levers you have to pull in order to increase that, and sort of like bring, not only more revenue into the company, but to do it faster. So I think just understanding your CAC is the other thing there that I would just recommend everybody take a look at as well. But these numbers are just sort of like generic, throw it out there numbers, but it does take from some sort of basic principles of really SaaS, which is sort of a 4x quota based on your OTE. And some average ramp times that we've seen in the market. So hopefully this is useful.
Another question from the audience, I think it's a really good one as we talk about defining ramp time. And I know the answer kind of is different, but so often, particularly you and I are in the Bay Area, so we live in this little weird bubble. I know it's not always like this in Omaha. So, out here, it's kind of like, let's hire somebody on Monday, and by this Friday, they need to be on the phone, or by next Friday, they better be on the phone, right? Yeah. How do you, and maybe you're going to talk about this later, how do you build that into the ramp time? Like, yes, there's value to getting people on the phone sooner than later, but then there's value on making sure they're educated. Have you come across a magic number that says, hey, don't put your rep on the phone until they've been through 7.24 days of training, right? Do you have anything like that yet that you can share with the team? It's a great question from the audience. I appreciate you asking.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I think it's kind of a two-part question, right? Like, one of it is almost like a cultural question of, hey, I don't necessarily feel comfortable putting my rep on the phone this Friday. How should I be thinking about that? And I think culturally, like, it's always good to set a high bar for any hire that you're making. I'm not a consultant on culture, so I'll kind of just leave it at that. And I think the other part of the question is, what are the best practices in terms of like actionably how you should sort of do a step ladder of the ramp time. And in 2 slides, I'm actually going to talk about how we do that internally here at Mixmax. So I'll get into that here in just a sec. But I think even before you do that, jumping to the next slide, you need to understand, how do I benchmark what my ramp should be? And so another great data point from this report that I linked at the top here that anybody can check out is, what is the average ramp time based on the ACV, or average contract value, of the deals that I'm selling? Now, everybody on this call has a different average contract value, and that probably means you fall into a different bucket. And so I think looking at this graph here, we can see basically less than 5K, 5 to 25, 25 to 100, and sort of big ticket 100 plus. And right out of the gate, what you can see is that bigger deals typically mean longer ramp times. I'm not going to argue with that. What I want to point out here is that at every single ACV, there are a subcategory of folks that are ramping in 1 to 3 months. Whether you're selling at 5K, where that's a whole 40%, or whether you're selling it at 100K, where it's only 5%, there are folks at every level of these ACV buckets that are doing it in shorter periods of time. And I think all that is to say is that this is something that you can control. It's something that you can put time and effort and cycles into to bring down the ramp time. And if you look at data points, yeah, it does say on average it takes longer if you have a longer deal cycle, and that's important to call out. But you should also know that there are folks who are doing it in less time. And I think everybody who's a part of this sales hacker community is looking to be, and probably already is to a certain extent, in that top 5%. So I
We'd like to think so, or we're at least achieving, we're trying to get there, right? Like, some people are still figuring it out. So, and I love that you're sourcing this stuff from the Bridge Group. For folks who don't know, Trish and Matt Bertuzzi, who put this data together, they spend a ton of time getting it right. They explain that their data's there. They've got data scientists. So it's not just some sales guru like Richard creating numbers and throwing them up on a slide to look pretty, or Robbie. There's real data behind their stuff. So, and the cool thing about Bridge Group, again, they give this kind of data away for free. So they're not going to make you pay for it, which is really, really nice. And so they, I love the Bridge Group, and I do want to respect what they've done for this community, and let everybody know you should check them out. They're really, really solid folks. So, all right. So let's talk about let's go forward a little bit more, Robbie. Where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about, how do we think about the levers we have in an organization, right? Which is this notion of hiring more reps and sort of making them more effective, efficient, and ramping them faster. We broke down on the ramp cycles. What do the averages look like across different organizations? And then we talked about the opportunity for improvement, right? Looking at the difference between 6 months and 2 months in that example I used. And now we've kind of taken a look at, well, where might I fall based on the average contract value? And I think from here, what we can talk about are what are some actionable things you can do about it, right? What are some things that I can walk out of this with and take back to my organization? And I had a million things that I wanted to say on this webinar, but I tried to boil it down to the ones that folks could take away and do this week. And take them out of this call and implement this week as ways that I've materially seen improvement on ramp times and time to productivity. So I think we go there next. So jumping to the next slide, we talked about this notion of efficiency, and I think you can actually think about your ramp program, your onboarding program, as a combination of efficiency and effectiveness. So we think about efficiency being time and effort to complete cycles. Well, what are those cycles that we need to complete during the ramp time? I think there's a couple things to think about right out of the gate. The first that I really like to call out to people is we're all stretched thin, right? Everybody is working hard, figuring out how they can add the most value. And you can use automation to bubble up the right things at the right time to your reps. And most organizations have access to these types of tools. If not, there's a lot of them available. But the first thing that I think is extremely important for any sales leader is document and share messaging. And what you're doing by templating the best messages, not only to send to your customers, but internally in your organization, is you're saying there is a certain level that we need to execute at in terms of our communication, and we report on it and we train people on it. And so giving your reps the access to sort of the best objection handling templates that you have, the best ways to work internally with different stakeholders in the organization, that's immediately going to make them communicating at the same level of somebody who's been in your organization for 6 months. That decreases ramp time. They don't have to figure that out anymore. So that's
I want to pause you there real quick, and we're allowed to drop names, right? What are some of your favorite tools to help you do this, right? I think we probably know 80% of them, but maybe there's one or two we haven't heard of. So what are your favorites?
Totally. So I think, for the very, very nascent early stage company, Google Docs, right out of the gate. If you don't have any budget whatsoever to invest in something, you can give you some analytics and sharing abilities. Good old Google Docs does the trick. You can share that with new hires when they come on board. Almost every sort of early stage sales organization uses G Suite and Gmail, and that's something that's immediately available to you. Most of the organizations I work with at Mixmax, they use Mixmax to do this, and it's a great tool to basically build and share templating and share across your entire organization or specific teams within the organization, and always have access to that right from the body of Gmail. So that's a little bit of a step up from kind of basic document sharing, but there are access points at every level of company.
Great. Awesome. All right. So let's go. And what kind of things, by the way, so we have objection handling, right? If you think about onboarding somebody in their playbook, what are the other things that should be templated, right? So objection handling is one. Are you talking about elevator pitches and call scripts too? Are you what are those other things they should be documenting if they haven't started yet?
So those are good things, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves
Okay.
in terms of reaching out to the customer. We'll talk about that in a sec.
Okay.
Before we're even spending too much time, communicating externally, there's sort of a motion for internal communication that folks need to follow as well. Helping folks understand how to work with their billing team or work with their engineering and product team. All of that templating can provide a framework for just the best way to communicate both internally and externally. The other thing that you can do is thinking about your onboarding program as starting before the start date. Now, I know this is going to be a little bit controversial, Richard, but I actually think that it's the responsibility of the new hire to be preparing for the start date ahead of time. But I think a lot of times what folks don't understand, especially if it's an earlier stage company, is what resources should I be looking at? What should I be doing to prepare? And just one really simple thing that you can do as a sales leader is put together an email sequence. So that's a multi-touch program sequence of emails that you send out. And I think of this as the 0 week sequence. So a week before somebody starts, here are a couple resources that this new hire can review, whether that's reading material, a book, something about the product that they can review, anything to kind of rehearse and get that motion going so that folks are moving and they have their blood going the day they get into the office. I think that not enough companies are doing that. I think it's a little bit, people tiptoe around the notion of assigning tasks before somebody starts. But I think that everybody has about 4 to 5 hours to play with right there for folks that are coming on board before they get started. And you can use sequences as an easy way to manage that.
Absolutely. And the one thing I would encourage everybody, please share your case studies. Like if there's one thing, if you're a new hire yourself, if you're changing jobs this year, one of the smartest things you can do, aside from reviewing them before your interview, is make sure if there are published case studies, memorize as many of them as you possibly can, because that will literally cut, I don't think it just cuts a lot of knowledge internally, and it allows you to come to your training asking questions rather than just sitting there going, So those case studies and use case things, if you can find them or share them, those are big wins for me.
Totally. And the last thing I like to do is set up alerts. So I don't necessarily just like a lot of folks don't always have the time to make sure that every new hire is completing every task, because there's so many tasks that need to be completed in that first 2 weeks that we're micromanaging. So what I do is in the background, I set up triggered alerts, and I use our Mixmax product called Rules, where I'm able to give myself alerts anytime something in Salesforce, Slack, or any of the other systems that we use are updated. And I just get updated in real time, so I know at the end of the day who is pacing in terms of their ramp program. And so there are a lot of other products in the market that you use to do API integrations and set up triggered alerts. But the basic thinking here is that you don't want to put yourself in a position to have to manually go check in on every single task that you're assigning. When you're building these tasks in this program, think about what are some ways that I can automate getting triggered alerts for the completion of these tasks that I'm assigning. So that's kind of the efficiency part of the equation. Now, Richard, as you like to typically say, it's not all about efficiency. You got to have the effectiveness part of it too, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've become so efficient with our tools, it's a wonder we have to show up for work anymore.
You're right, but we do, and I think that how do we actually use these tools to become more effective? So here's what we're actually going to talk about. What are the steps? What's the program? So this is actually our Mixmax onboarding sales ramp plan, and this is stuff that I've taken from years and years of building programs at some of these other companies, and also just having the opportunity to talk to folks that spend a lot of time doing this. And the first thing right out of the gate that I like to call out, there is such thing as a 0 week. You should be doing it. Use automation and tools to give your reps the resources, the research they're expected to complete, reading, and any expectation setting that you can do ahead of time. That is just all that is going to do is help you when that person shows up on day one, and you can have already checked off some of those boxes. Now, you probably can't give them their laptop and all of their sign-on, but there are some things that you can share with them. So just think about what those things might be. Now, in week one, what we like to do in Mixmax is we actually have everybody take a turn on customer success. So everybody who starts at our company is a customer success rep in their first 2 weeks on the job, and they actually have a quota of the number of tickets that they need to complete. What this accomplishes is just being able to interact directly with our customers on the very first week on the job, understand what experience they're having with the product and the service, and resolve any issues that may need to be resolved right out of the gate. I think that this is a super easy thing that everybody can do.
Yeah, and when you say everybody, you don't just mean salespeople, you mean someone in marketing, someone in engineering. It's everybody, right?
It's everybody. We got our engineers working tickets. I can actually see a few of them doing it right now. So it's something that, no matter sort of the seniority or department in the organization, everybody does it.
That's brilliant. I love that.
Yeah. The next thing I love folks to do is, I think one of the things you should ask yourself is, how much exposure can I give this new hire to our internal product? And immediately right out of the gate on their first day, schedule on the calendar a live product demonstration, not with a customer, but internally with the team, where your team is role playing the customer and your new hire is giving a live product demo. Make it 5 to 10 minutes. Invite somebody from your executive team so they get a little bit of a different look and the pressure is ramped up a little bit more. And set the expectation, the first Wednesday that our new hires start, they give a live product demo to our CEO. And that's something where that is one way to force you to get your hands dirty and click on every single corner of your product and try to learn it inside out as best you can. And nobody ever nails it perfectly, but it sets the expectation that everybody's a product expert and needs to be from the very beginning. And this is an area that you have to invest in. So product expertise is something that I think a lot of times in sales, you hope you hire people that understand the product and learn it over time. But if you make it a priority in the first couple of weeks, all you're doing is increasing that comprehension, and that's reflected, down the line. Week 2, we move to activity. So managing dials, emails, and meetings booked. We use Mixmax to give ourselves alerts and understand how folks are doing on this. Most folks use some kind of CRM system that they can put together to get some reads on this as well. But week 2 is going to be all about getting the pipeline started, right? Starting to reach out to folks, getting your emails started, and booking meetings, and actually having a target of meetings that are booked for week 2 as something that needs to be checked off, right? And then moving to week 3, now we've actually got some of those meetings that are starting to happen, so we're leading our discovery calls and demos. And then hopefully by week 4, again, this is depending on your sales cycle, but for us internally, we're having managers join the rep to tag team, some of these closing calls. And so what you can see here is there is no demoing outside of internal demos until week 3. There aren't any sort of like closing call conversations that are necessarily happening until week 4. If they do by chance, that's great. But we like to really focus on kind of those core things in the beginning, and then actually having KPIs that people need to hit for every single one of these items week over week.
So there's a couple of questions coming in from the audience, and I think they're gravitating to this. Questions like, well, where do you start role playing, right? When do you teach them the internal integrations of, here's how you log, deals in our CRM, Salesforce, right? Here's what, the different fields mean. How do we teach them about our field creep, right? All that's, where do you, and again, I'm assuming it's kind of fluid, but I think people want to hear from you is like, well, where do you put in some of those very, very specific tactical things that have to occur to improve all of the efficiency and effectiveness?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I tried to keep it as few words as I could on this presentation, so I left some of that stuff out. That's week 2. Week 2 is internal process. I look at week 1 on site as we need to understand why this company exists in the first place and what our mission is and what our customers care about and what problems we're solving for those customers, as well as our product and sort of underlying architecture. So week 1, I'm pulling in every resource that I possibly can internally in the company. I'm asking executives who have a million things to do if they can spare an hour of their time to train new folks on the backbones of our product or how we run our customer success team. And then once we get to week 2, it's all about dialing into your process. And hopefully you've been documenting a sales playbook where you can actually review step by step. How do we think about our CRM? What really matters? What are some of the core things that we need to focus, like points that we need to get across over calls? So I think of it as week 1 being really company education focused and week 2 being sales process focused.
I think that's beautiful, and I love the fact that you said your onboarding playbook and your sales playbook overlap. They're not the same thing. So many times people take a sales playbook and try and make it the onboarding Playbook or vice versa. And it's okay to have two separate documents and refer to them each other, at the right time. But I really love how you put that in there. That's great. That's really, really solid. What about, in theory, basic sales training? Is that somewhere between week 2 and 3? Is it part of week 2? Where do you normally put that? Like teaching reps how to handle the conversation, right? Because that part matters. It doesn't always happen through osmosis.
Totally. It's a good point. A couple things that you can do there. I would highly recommend if you're doing inside sales product demonstrations, recording those demos. You can typically do that with any screen sharing software, and then actually adding notes that reps can review, putting a folder together and then sharing that folder with folks. I actually do that as a 0-week exercise. So we'll typically share some folders of pre-recorded calls and emails along with notes and like key things to listen for and look out for, so that reps are listening for this right out of the gate. And then once folks get inside internally, we're doing this together, right? So if it's the discovery and demos portion, we're doing that in week 3, hip to hip. Week 4, same thing if we're doing some later stage conversations. So it's the kind of thing where you can put some together by downloading and documenting, but this is best done in real time.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm getting a ton of questions from the audience, and I want to sort of say, I'll sort of briefly say them, but then sort of I'll answer them for you if that's all right. I don't see a 3-day onboarding session or anything like that in the schedule. Should there be a 3-day or 4-day onboarding training? I think the answer to that is yes. This slide was meant to be an overview, and then what you fill in the blanks in those weeks will depend on what you're looking for, Cliff. It's a great question. Melanie asked the question of, is this cadence created on your sales cycle? Is this the mix-max sales cycle? Or should it be artificially accelerated based on the different size, by the size of the team, the size of the deal, the size of the sales cycle, so that what you're doing in literally 5 weeks, you could do in 3, because, it could be Yelp, right? Where it's just not that long of a cycle. So it doesn't take that long to do that. I think the answer to that is yes, but I just wanted to sort of confirm that with you, Robbie.
Yeah, so the answer to that is jump back to that slide where you look at your ramp time based on the ACV category that you fall into. Take a look at that, ask yourself the question, how fast should my reps be ramping? What does that top 5% look like? And then make adjustments. This slide is really just there to represent what are the things that we measure, right? Like what are the actual kind of like KPI step ladders that we put into place? So every single one of these has its own measurement utensil where we're actually giving sort of like a target that reps have to hit, whether that's CS tickets closed, meetings booked, number of manager and reps tag team calls that we're running together. You can condense that or compress it as needed. What I would say is that by doing it on a week over week basis, what you allow yourself to do is spend multiple days focusing on how to execute one of these activities at a really, really high level. So think about breaking it out over a period of time so that you can make sure that everybody on the team is crystal clear on how your discovery works, so on and so forth.
By the way, Robbie, someone actually asked this, which I think is a great question. We didn't even clarify. What is your average sales cycle at MixMax, and what's your average deal size, if you're allowed to say it? We know, if it's confidential, we understand, but I think that'll give some people a point of reference.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I can share a little bit. Like Richard said earlier, we've been really fortunate to be like kind of a viral product in the history of the company, where a lot of folks actually self-serve into the product, and that typically means lower ACV deals. But since we've put together like a more professionalized enterprise sales team, that's gone up significantly. So the data is a little bit blurry. On the one hand, you have sort of self-serve data. On the one hand, you have sort of enterprise sales data. So it stretches anywhere from some weeks on the fast side to months, but sort of nothing beyond a quarter, just to kind of give like a range without sharing all of our secret sauce. That's roughly like kind of the sales time. And in terms of the ACV, anywhere, again, it depends. Like typically for folks that are self-serving, those tend to be 5 to 10K tickets. For folks that we're working on our enterprise packages, those are quite a bit more. So it depends on the customer.
That's great. And does this process change and I don't know how you have your team set up, but let's assume you had a team that's sort of co-managing that self-serve deals. Well, granted, they're self-serve, you're not spending a lot of time with them.
Yeah.
Would this process be much shorter than 5 weeks, or would you still, even though it's a small deal, take the time to make sure they know it right, regardless of how fast that sales cycle is?
I would take the time to make sure they know it right. Now, what I'm not saying here is that don't keep, don't keep your bulls like in the cage for 5 weeks if you don't need to, right? By all means, if you can ramp in less than 2 months, do it. But this is really just to make the point that you should be thinking about all the steps in your process that you can quantify, and then breaking those down and sort of associating like a target that a rep has to perform on during their ramping time as a way to indicate to you that they're showing the knowledge and effectiveness that they're going to need to sustain like long-term productivity. So all of this is adjustable, malleable. You can have folks that are hopping on calls with customers in week 1 and week 2, but don't underestimate the power of breaking down your process into steps and then putting a target on performing that individual step effectively to kind of prove, okay, there's retention, there's understanding, we can move on to the next step.
Great. And by the way, speaking of moving on, we've got about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to shut up and let you sort of run through these slides. And if questions come up, we'll hold them till the end at this point. But thank you, everybody, for asking.
Perfect timing, and I really appreciate all the questions and happy to answer any even after this. So this is the final slide, just actions that you guys can take away. So right out of the gate, again, and there's a lot of follow-ons that we can do here, but what are some things that we can do by Friday? We can use sequences to share the resources and best practices during week 1 and 2, and don't underestimate week 0. Use that week, give your reps the opportunity to prepare a little bit more. It's a simple step and some expectation setting you can do during the interview and offer letter process where you're letting people know, hey, I'm going to send you an email or two a couple weeks before we get started. You'll see them come in day over day, which is a quick thing that you can do to prepare and hit the ground running faster. Document and share your highest performing templates. You know who your best reps are. Part of what makes them successful is their ability to communicate effectively with prospects, both over the phone and over email. Document both of those things. Make it shareable, measure it, and see how those templates are performing. There's a lot of tools you can use. Mixmax is a great one to do it. And then using triggers. So another thing that we love to do internally is use our own product to trigger us when reps hit milestones. So all of those things we just talked about, weeks 0 through 4, those are milestones with alerts that you can set up to trigger based out of your CRM and give you as a manager the heads up that that action has been completed so that you can then go quickly micromanage your rep to move to the next task, complete that task, and sort of show that retention and knowledge. So those are three things that you can do to take away. There's plenty more, but I think that building and separating out your onboarding playbook from your sales playbook is something everybody can do, and encourage you to go through that exercise as well to figure out what is my gross margin and what might be my target to improve it.
Yeah, that's great. I've got a great question. Cliff sent this early, and I've sort of held it. And Cliff, thanks for your patience. Cliff's question is, well, dude, what happens if it takes like 4 to 5 quarters for my reps to normally ramp? Our deal cycle is 9 to 12 months. Yeah. I'm selling to this enterprise multi-$100,000 deals, right? Should we really be defining our ramp time as hitting full quota if it normally takes them 4 to 5 quarters to do that? Or in that type of a large enterprise sale, do we want to have a micro ramp time or some mini micro ramp times along the way, some plateaus we want to hit? Any feedback on something like that where it's this much bigger, longer sales cycle?
Yeah. So thank you for the question, Cliff. I think it's a fair question and something probably a lot of people that are in your position are wondering. I would not let the fact that you have a longer sales cycle prevent you from breaking this down into a granular week-to-week, day-to-day focused way for the first 2 months of your reps joining and beyond that. I think what you can think about is even breaking down on a quarter-by-quarter basis, looking at what those quotas on a quarter basis might be and decreasing them quarter to quarter, not necessarily thinking about that 12-month mark, but actually breaking it down into bite-sized chunks and thinking about how can I make Q3 of ramp shorter, and what are some ways that we can measure that and sort of show retention. I think it's easy to say, oh, because it's stretched out over such a long period of time, having such a micro focus early on might not necessarily be of the same value. I completely disagree, and I think you should think about what are some ways that I can actually break down this giant goal that we have into more like digestible, smaller goals that we can then micromanage during that 2-month period and beyond.
That's great. That's great. Another question coming from Miranda. Thanks, Miranda. Do you mind sharing some of the software and apps you've mentioned earlier to the sales stack? obviously we talked about mix match.
Yeah.
I know I heard you sort of, say Slack. I didn't know if that sort of
Mhm.
competes with you a little bit or overlaps with what you guys do, but what are some of those other tools? And like I said, it's totally appropriate to say them because people want to know, right?
Totally. Yeah, great question. I can geek out on this all day, and I'm happy to take the conversation to Twitter or anything like that afterwards. But right out of the gate, and just to clarify, what Slack is to internal communications, Mixmax is to external communications. And so we work with any customer-facing rep to help them perform better and get access to the to the right tools and bring everything into Gmail. So I think anybody in a customer-facing role, Mixmax is a great option. It's something that you can use to plug into Gmail and pull all of your systems into one place so that you can work out of Gmail. Slack is a good one. I think it can be a little bit distracting. We use a couple tools to actually record our calls internally and give reps feedback. Gong.io is the tool we use. Absolutely love it. Let's see. I think that there's definitely such a thing as too many tools. And my personal belief in like a sales tool like a Salesforce or a CRM is that it's not necessarily the best idea to cut reps loose and just let them sort of like go wild in Salesforce and see what they can find. I typically like to recommend people like define the sort of reports that matter, the lead lists that matter, and then otherwise kind of pull information out of Salesforce and use API integrations versus having reps spend an enormous amount of time prospecting into Salesforce. And then I would say anything that gets your reps out on the market thinking about what customers are going to be the best fit. So that could be anything from like a Clearbit or some kind of like enrichment tool to prospecting tools that you can drill into and actually do research onto what customers are going to be the best fit. I love that because I think you get ROI not only on building out your database and lead lists, but having your reps thinking about what customers we should be going after.
Yeah, Miranda had another follow-up question, and I can go an extra minute or two because I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. But what are some of the triggers you're looking for? What are some of the templates? Like, can you define triggers for people so that they understand what a trigger really means for them?
Yeah, totally. So a couple examples. With Mixmax specifically, we have a rules product where, if a lead is created or if a task is created, or really if any action whatsoever is taken in Salesforce, whether that's automated on the back end or your new rep going in and performing that task themselves, you can create an alert. Whether that alert goes to yourself, to the rep, or to the team at large, you can do that. So one example of something I do is once my reps hit 50 completed calls on the day, I get a Slack message that alerts me and tells me, hey, this is done. And then I would then go in and just do a quick note on my notebook. Okay, great, we're moving on to the next task. You can use that in like a myriad of different ways, but triggers and rules are a great way to just define the things that need to be completed and then set up whether it's automation and you move things through your sales cycle by updating fields or just getting an alert yourself. It's an easy way to make sure that's happening. In terms of templates, I think that's a question that you got to answer for yourself a little bit. We like to have some folders that are kind of our best practices and highest performing templates that are always being updated in real time. That's everything from objection handling with customers to the simple things. How do I do my handoff from SDR to AE if that's your process? How do I do my handoff from sales to CS? How do I make sure that billing is completed? And just putting all that information into one template ensures that reps are always doing it the right way and are held accountable. And also, B, gives you reporting on the back end to tell you how these different messages are performing, who's opening them, so on and so forth. So just like a couple quick easy things, easy wins that you guys can pick up to do right out of the gate and make your onboarding program right for you.
Got it. This is a great question from John, by the way. John says, well, what do you do when the wheels come off, right? KPIs are missed during the ramp period. Now you got to manage people, right?
That's that micromanage thing we talked about, and that's a great call out. It doesn't always work perfectly. I've had it work not perfectly more often in my career than it has worked perfectly. In fact, it never works perfectly, right? It's always a process for continuous improvement, and that's why you have these rules and alerts set up so that you're triggered and you're informed right away so that you can take action. And that's where you can't be scared to step right in and correct course, right? I think the risk that you run in not micromanaging and having these rules and triggers set up is that it takes a couple days, a couple weeks to figure out that the wheels are falling off a little bit. And that's when we start to push that ramp time out multiple months, because it's a compounding effect where every day lost can be as much as a week lost in terms of the overall ramp time to get to productivity, which is why you need to have this infrastructure and the expectations set up to do everything you can to mitigate the risk of the wheels falling off, but have the mindset that they're going to, and then you got to be there if and when it inevitably does.
So I'm going to make I assume this is what Mixmax does, because we've talked about these triggers sort of alerting you as the manager, but can't you also set up these triggers to alert the rep that, hey, you haven't accomplished this much by today? If you were supposed to make 50 activities today and it's 2 o'clock and you've only done 30, can't we use that trigger to create accountability for the rep so that they're not necessarily feeling micromanaged, but they're learning how to manage their own time, so that it doesn't always have to be Robbie coming in to say, dude, you didn't do this, right? What happened, right? Can you use triggers that way?
Yeah, well, I told Richard I didn't know if we want to get into our own secret sauce a little bit too much, but yeah, you absolutely can. And you can set up sort of like day-to-day targets, quotas, criteria, where reps will get alerted based on sort of like the setup that you have internally. So you think about, what are these KPIs? Well, we know on week 2, we're focused on activity, emails, calls, and meetings booked. We know that day 1, we've got our lead list and we need to get to 40 calls on that first day. If we get to 37, is it the responsibility of the manager to go into the CRM later that day, identify that, and give feedback?
No.
Is it the responsibility of the rep to speak up? Or do we have a trigger set up where everybody's alerted and everybody knows they're going to be alerted about it? And so the expectation is set that way. And I think that the latter is the way to go.
So I think it's all about accountability. I think I read it in Jocko Willick's book about extreme ownership, and he's talking about SEAL teams, and they defined accountability meaning that it's my job to make sure no one has to come on and clean up behind me, right? So if you're a rep, that means I don't want my manager coming to bother me. I want to show my manager that I got this, that I'm in charge and I can get it done. Yeah. As a manager, I do want to be notified, not because I want to micromanage them, because I do want to be supportive, but I also want to give you enough freedom. Even though I'm micromanaging your process, I also want to give you enough freedom that you can be accountable to yourself, right? And there's a strong balance in there. And I think that we didn't really talk about accountability through the onboarding process, which we probably should have in hindsight, but I think there's a big piece of that where the reps themselves have to own a little bit of this too. And I would encourage people to build in some accountability into your onboarding process, right? And you can, believe me, you can do this with Salesforce reports that automatically run and send an email, right? Like it's, if you're that early stage company where you just got Google Docs and Salesforce, you can make that stuff happen. So anyway, so I think accountability is a really huge piece that maybe we should talk about in another one.
Yeah, I think we could do a follow-on all about accountability. I think that you're right, and that's so much of that comes from the expectation setting you do during the hiring process, and that 0 week. So I want to recommend everybody take advantage of that 0 week before folks get started and do some expectation setting about what's going to be happening during that 4 weeks. Once you outline, okay, here's my sales onboarding program.
I'm gonna let you know you're gonna get a call or a phone call from Jake. Jake wants to talk about how do you use LMS systems to improve onboarding, right? Maybe in conjunction with Mix Match. He sounds like he's a big fan. Maybe you owe him $20 because you told him to ask that question. I'm not sure, but he definitely has some questions for you about continuing this process, which I think others would want to hear about at some point too. But we've gone over our hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and particularly yours, Robbie. Thank you everybody for joining in. We really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating webinar, and I think it's gonna be one that people need to go back and listen to again, particularly if you're starting to build and tweak your onboarding process. It's been really great, Robbie. If people want to get a hold of you, how can they?
Yeah, totally. That's my Twitter handle, @_Robbie Allen. I'm still trying to track down the one who owns @Robbie Allen. If anybody knows him, let me know. I'll bid on it. Or you can just go to mixmax.com if you want to learn more about what we're doing. But Twitter, LinkedIn, those are great places to find me.
Great. Robbie, thank you again. And thanks to Mixmax for, I hope I said it right. I think I said it wrong the other day, and you had to correct me. Mixmax. I want to appreciate that what you guys have done in sponsoring this webinar and giving us some awesome knowledge. So thank you again, Robbie.
100%, Richard. It's always a pleasure. Thanks to everybody who took some time out of their day to join me, and excited to connect with folks afterwards and keep the knowledge going.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.